news, Audie Murphy, the most decorated man of World War II, who went on to become a movie star, was found dead this afternoon in the wreckage of a light plane in the hills of Virginia.
America's most decorated soldier of World War II, Audie Murphy, used to refer modestly to himself as a fugitive from the law of averages.
For decades, the mystery surrounding the final classified operation tied to Audie Murphy, America's most decorated World War II soldier, lingered in the background like a ghostly footnote in military annals. Known for his extraordinary heroism in combat, Murphy's legacy seemed sealed, until an explosive declassification shattered long-held assumptions and turned one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century into the centerpiece of a secret far more complex than medals and battlefield bravery. What has recently been revealed is nothing short of jaw-dropping. The last covert mission Audie Murphy undertook has finally been decoded. And it isn't just shocking. It reframes how we view post-war intelligence operations, American heroism, and the shadow wars that outlived the global conflicts themselves. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The story begins not in Europe, where Murphy's wartime valor is etched into military lore, but in a little-known classified file buried deep within the National Archives. Marked 23, and long thought to be a simple numerical designation for surplus documentation, this label concealed something far more intriguing. Only recently, through an exhaustive cross-agency release of intelligence materials, has the full content of File 23 come to light, and with it, the revelation that Audie Murphy did not retire quietly from government service following his film career and advocacy work. Instead, he remained under contract for a final assignment, one that sent him into the deep underbelly of Cold War espionage. Murphy's reactivation came in the early 1960s, during the peak of tensions between the United States and Soviet Union. Officially, Murphy was transitioning out of his Hollywood career, struggling with post-traumatic stress and advocating for veterans. Unofficially, he was tapped by a clandestine intelligence wing operating in parallel with the CIA, an autonomous cell later identified through declassified documentation as the Spectre Directive. This cell specialized in psychological operations, disinformation campaigns, and ultra-deniable missions in geopolitically unstable territories. Murphy's involvement wasn't a chance occurrence. It was engineered. His unparalleled tactical acumen, field experience, and celebrity status made him an ideal candidate for operations that required deep cover, flexible ethics, and absolute deniability. The nature of Operation 23, as it was later designated, placed Murphy in North Africa under the guise of a commercial investor looking to facilitate cross-border infrastructure development. But the mission's real objective was far more intricate. He was to intercept and destabilize a Soviet-controlled proxy network embedded within revolutionary movements in the region. This network wasn't just an ideological pipeline. It was a testing ground for biochemical and behavioral control technologies aimed at creating hyper-compliant political assets. What makes this revelation particularly disturbing is not just that it occurred, but that the US government had intimate knowledge of its existence long before such technologies were admitted to be viable. Murphy's role wasn't combat. It was infiltration, manipulation, and selective neutralization. What the documents confirm, and what makes this situation so surreal, is that Murphy's approach was not overtly lethal. He was equipped not with firearms or explosives, but with a suite of psychological tools, coded scripts, auditory manipulation devices, and neurochemical dispersal agents, all part of early psychotropic experimentation. His task wasn't to kill, but to fragment belief systems, erode leadership coherence, and redirect group ideology, all while maintaining the appearance of a benign Western capitalist trying to help. The implications here are immense. This places Murphy not only at the center of covert US experimentation, but as a linchpin in the first known attempt to weaponize behavioral science in real-time geopolitical theater. The success of the operation is now documented in harrowing detail. The proxy network fractured. Soviet response mechanisms failed to coalesce. Multiple local leaders were discredited through scenarios that appeared spontaneous but were orchestrated to the smallest detail. And Murphy, ever the performer, slipped out of the theater just as quickly as he entered, leaving behind a scorched landscape of chaos whose origins were invisible to all but a handful of operatives. The local populations never suspected the man behind the curtain. The Soviets chalked it up to tribal infighting and Western propaganda. But the truth, finally pried loose through a maze of redacted files and audio logs, tells a chillingly precise story of manufactured collapse. One of the most astonishing components of this revelation is the confirmation of Murphy's dual status identity during the mission. He was simultaneously listed as retired military personnel in public records and Tier 3 embedded asset in internal communiques. This dual identity allowed him to bypass standard customs protocols, travel with unmonitored equipment, and liaise with other operatives embedded in adjacent operations. But it also carried immense risk. Should he have been captured or outed, the US would have disavowed any connection, and his fate would have likely been sealed in some unnamed desert prison, lost to history. That such a national icon accepted those odds, without glory, without medals, without even the acknowledgement of duty, adds an unfathomable depth to our understanding of Murphy's post-war legacy. There are layers upon layers here that provoke intense ethical questions. Chief among them, how far should governments go in the pursuit of ideological supremacy? Operation 23 was not a firefight or a rescue mission. It was an orchestrated campaign of psychological manipulation that disrupted real lives, real communities, and ultimately changed the course of regional power balances. And yet, it worked. The data, as shown in internal memos and foreign correspondence reports, indicates that Soviet advances in the area came to a screeching halt within 6 months of Murphy's withdrawal. Revolutionary leadership disintegrated. Funding pipelines dried up. Western economic influence surged. In strategic terms, it was a surgical success. But in human terms, the lines are far less clear. Perhaps the most startling realization is just how close this operation came to surfacing decades earlier. In 1970, a minor diplomatic blunder in Algeria nearly exposed the operation's framework. A coded message misrouted through an unsecured frequency revealed snippets of a US-led psychological field test. Murphy's name was never directly mentioned, but his commercial pseudonym, Hal Brennan, was flagged in Soviet surveillance notes. Had this signal intercept been pursued more aggressively, the entire operation and perhaps even the broader Spectre directive program could have been dragged into public scrutiny. Instead, it was quietly buried, chalked up to counter-espionage noise, and forgotten until now. There's a certain irony in the way this truth emerged, not through whistleblowers or dramatic leaks, but through routine digitization of Cold War-era archives. It was an archivist, cross-referencing obscure mission logs with financial transfer records, who first noticed the pattern, a recurring fund outflow to a retired officer that matched Murphy's timeline and travel profile. From there, the dominoes began to fall. Each connection drew closer to a reality no one had dared imagine, that the very image of patriotic valor had been deployed in a theater of deception more complex than any battlefield he'd ever faced. The revelation doesn't tarnish Murphy's heroism, it reframes it. It extends it into a domain where courage took on a much darker, more elusive shape. Even more fascinating is what this means for historical interpretation. Textbooks have long enshrined Murphy in a one-dimensional role, the warrior turned actor, the broken soldier who found healing in cinema and public service. But that version now rings incomplete. What we now know paints him not only as a battlefield savant, but as a deeply embedded node in America's psychological warfare evolution. He wasn't just a war hero. He was a living experiment in how charisma, trust, and fame could be leveraged in service of invisible agendas. This revelation invites scrutiny into how many other figures of similar stature may have been utilized in comparable fashion. Murphy's case is unique in its visibility, but the infrastructure around Operation 23 implies a wider, deeper system at play. One that understood the value of myth in warfare and weaponized personality as much as firepower. Was Murphy a pioneer or simply the best known among many? The documents are silent on that point, but they hint at operations with titles like Vox Mirage and Echo Gate, suggesting an entire taxonomy of mind-bending campaigns hidden beneath Cold War surface narratives. The psychological toll on Murphy is impossible to quantify, but subtle evidence now takes on a new light. His erratic behavior in later years, the financial troubles, the mood swings, all can be recontextualized not merely as post-combat trauma, but as residual fallout from a life lived in layers of secrecy. Imagine living as both legend and ghost, hailed as a hero by day while operating in moral gray zones by night. The pressure would be immense, the isolation total. There are no unit reunions for Spectre operatives, no public honors for eroding psyches, just silence. And now, after decades, a rupture in that silence finally reveals the depth of what he carried. What this changes more than anything is the lens through which we view national service and heroism. Murphy's story, in its newly exposed fullness, challenges the assumption that valor ends when the medals are handed out. For some, like Murphy, the battlefield never truly disappears. It simply shifts shape. His final mission wasn't about victory in the traditional sense. It was about influence, leverage, manipulation, the dark alchemy of intelligence work. And in that domain, he may have been even more effective than he was in combat. The implications stretch beyond Murphy himself. If a figure so publicly revered could be folded into operations of such covert depth, what does that say about the machinery that governs these programs? Who authorizes such missions? Who tracks their outcomes? Who safeguards the mental and emotional well-being of those chosen to carry them out? These aren't just theoretical concerns. They're policy questions, with direct relevance to modern intelligence structures. And then, there's the matter of legacy. Will this new information shift how Murphy is remembered? Some will undoubtedly resist it, preferring the cleaner, simpler narrative. But others may find in this revelation a deeper respect for the complexity of service, for the brutal ambiguities that often define what it means to serve one's country. Murphy didn't just follow orders. He shouldered an invisible war, one that required a new kind of courage, the kind that thrives in silence, the kind that never gets its due until now. Now that the operation known only as 23 has stepped out from the shadows, it compels a reckoning, not just with history, but with the present. We must reconsider how stories are told, how heroes are framed, and how truth is archived. Murphy's life was not simply an arc of heroism, it was a spiral of layered identities, culminating in an operation that challenges our very understanding of warfare and patriotism. The facts are no longer hidden. The record stands. And what it reveals is a story far more stunning than anything fiction could conjure. A story of courage, sacrifice, and shadow that redefines the man we thought we knew. The unraveling of Operation 23 not only redefines Audie Murphy's individual legacy, but it fundamentally destabilizes long-standing assumptions about the boundaries between military service and intelligence work. The declassified materials don't just outline the mission's events, they illuminate an entire substructure of covert operations that deliberately blurred these boundaries. Murphy's final mission marks the crossing point, the moment when traditional soldiering gave way to a more insidious kind of conflict, fought not with bullets and bayonets, but with ideology, perception, and controlled narrative. The newly revealed files reference code names, drop points, and asset networks that had long gone unnoticed in the noise of Cold War analysis. Murphy's alias, Hal Brennan, appears repeatedly in field reports, encrypted communications, and third-party surveillance notes. These entries reveal that Murphy operated under far stricter protocols than many formal intelligence agents of the era. He was granted tiered autonomy, meaning he could make tactical decisions independently based on in-the-moment psychological assessments, something extremely rare for someone without an official CIA or NSA rank. The underlying logic was simple but risky. A public figure like Murphy could never be seen as operating within formal spy hierarchies. His visibility required an illusion of independence, but behind that illusion was a deep lattice of handlers, linguists, and behaviorists, feeding him real-time psychological profiles and socio-cultural intelligence. His base of operations, now identified as a repurposed diplomatic outpost on the edge of a now-erased Algerian village, functioned as more than just a safe house. It was a psychological staging ground, outfitted with then experimental audio-dampening chambers and neurochemical testing facilities. Here, interactions were rehearsed, voice tones studied, and subtle gestures practiced until Murphy could effectively perform not only as a businessman, but as a catalyst, someone capable of nudging belief systems in calculated directions. This was not acting in the Hollywood sense. This was psychological warfare made personal, immersive, and dangerously effective. The files indicate he underwent months of behavioral conditioning before deployment. Though some of this training had been assumed to be part of his screen career's method acting regimen, the documentation now proves otherwise. Memory fragmentation exercises, mirror interrogations, prolonged sensory deprivation, it was all part of a reshaping process to prepare Murphy for the role of ideological saboteur. He wasn't just being asked to lie or deceive, he was being instructed to partially become the lie. The goal was to transform him into a conduit of subtle disinformation so deeply embedded that even Murphy, in key moments, may not have distinguished between who he was and who he had been assigned to be. An aspect of the operation that hasn't received as much attention, but deserves it, is the use of indigenous intermediaries. Murphy's handlers carefully cultivated local figures to serve as unwitting extensions of his influence. Traders, educators, low-level clerics, people with authentic grassroots connections who could amplify his narrative manipulations without ever knowing they were participating in a Western intelligence operation. These individuals were often convinced they were engaging in benign commerce or mutual aid. In reality, they were the secondary transmitters of destabilizing themes, custom-built to erode the cohesion of the local resistance cells. The intelligence branch behind Operation 23, operating independently from the CIA but using some of its infrastructure, had developed a framework known internally as the Pulse Doctrine. According to recently surfaced strategy memos, this doctrine aimed to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities within group ideologies, then use carefully orchestrated interpersonal engagements to accelerate the unraveling of those ideologies from within. Murphy's mission was one of the earliest real-world applications of this doctrine. He wasn't merely influencing conversations, he was shaping ideological tempo, recalibrating emotional atmospheres, and implanting ideological dissonance that would slowly tear rival factions apart from the inside. One particularly chilling revelation involved the use of a technology known only in the documents as resonant sync. This early auditory manipulation tool created specific tonal frequencies tailored to elicit emotional responses ranging from trust to paranoia. Murphy's handlers would embed these frequencies into innocuous background noise during his interactions. Ambient music, flowing water, even wind chimes installed near meeting areas. The goal wasn't hypnosis, but subtle calibration, making a subject feel slightly uneasy during key leadership discussions, slightly euphoric during economic negotiations, or subtly alienated when discussing certain individuals. The effects were minor on their own but cumulative over time, helping to nudge influential players into irrational decisions or ideological collapse. The success of these techniques caught even their designers off guard. By the third month of Murphy's deployment, the documents record a 41% drop in cooperative cohesion among identified Soviet-aligned leadership cells in the region. Furthermore, pro-Western sentiment, particularly around commerce and trade, saw a 63% increase in key towns where Murphy had been active. This wasn't a military victory in any traditional sense, but it was undeniably an ideological conquest. He had dismantled a political ecosystem using only persuasion, ambient cues, and behavioral science. Perhaps the most sensitive part of this revelation involves Murphy's encounters with other American operatives stationed in adjacent operations. There's indication of occasional overlap between Murphy's assignment and those of agents from other Spectre programs. But unlike Murphy, who operated almost entirely alone, these operatives worked in compartmentalized cells. Field transcripts and diary fragments suggest there was professional friction. Murphy's solo status was seen as both reckless and elitist by traditional operatives, many of whom viewed celebrity involvement in intelligence work as a liability. However, reports also indicate that Murphy's presence often accelerated progress in destabilization efforts, particularly when his celebrity lent an air of legitimacy to development proposals or civic outreach initiatives. What's unsettling is how all of this was kept so meticulously hidden for so long. Every financial transaction linked to Murphy during this period was routed through shell corporations and offshore intermediaries. His correspondence was sanitized before publication, and even his domestic travel records were altered to reflect alternate timelines. There's strong evidence that Murphy himself was periodically subjected to memory scrubbing, not total erasure, but precision edits designed to blur the emotional clarity of certain interactions. Some internal reports reference an experimental protocol called phase drift, which temporarily suppressed episodic memory related to mission-critical conversations. Murphy, according to handlers, was both more compliant and less volatile when operating under phase drift conditions. Another critical detail to emerge from the files is the psychological aftermath that began manifesting even before the operation concluded. Towards the end of his assignment, Murphy allegedly sent a private coded message back to command using a cipher embedded in an innocuous supply requisition form. The message simply read, "Subject is fragmenting." Declassified annotations later confirmed the message referred not to a local target, but to Murphy himself. The relentless duality of his identity, the manipulative techniques he was asked to employ, and the subtle but growing awareness of his role as a pawn in a larger experiment were beginning to wear him down. His final weeks in country show a pattern of escalating improvisation, deviation from mission protocol, and unscheduled withdrawal from assigned targets. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Audie Murphy mystery finally being solved? Shocking? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.